was my good fortune to lend a helping hand to the weary travelers flying from the land of bondage.
William Still was just a boy when he helped the first one escape. He never knew the man's name, only that he was being hunted by slave catchers. But in the years ahead, there would be many hundreds more. And Still vowed their stories would never be forgotten.
The heroism and desperate struggle that many of our people had to endure should be kept green in the memory of this and coming generations.
And he kept his promise. His diaries tell the secret stories of that great slave exodus known as the Underground Railroad. Impossible escapes, heartbreaking separations, and families reunited. William Still recorded it all, risking his own freedom to tell the stories of those who had the courage to run.
They were determined to have liberty, even at the cost of life.
Underground Railroad, the William Still story, is made possible by CN, built on strong foundations with roots in the early days of rail. CN serves Canada, the United States, and their markets with pride. CN, North America's railroad. And the Rogers Cable Network Fund. The Canada Media Fund. The Rogers Documentary Fund. With additional support from these funders. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people and viewers like you.
William Still never forgot where he came from. The first generation of his family, born free. Raised in New Jersey, Still moves to Philadelphia at age 26 to work as a laborer. But he's ambitious, a man who taught himself to read and write and wants to do something with it.
He was organized, he was hardworking, he was a great communicator. I can use a lot of adjectives to describe him. Most of the good traits that we want in a great leader, he had them.
In the fall of 1847, Still applies for a job with the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. He starts as a clerk, but he has eyes on something much bigger.
Perhaps it may be the means of more than rewarding me in some future days. I go for liberty and improvement.
His duties involve the publicly stated business of the society, correspondence, record keeping, and the publication of an abolitionist newspaper called the Pennsylvania Freeman. But Still knows its secret purpose is the running of a covert resistance network dedicated to helping slaves escape from the South. It's a revolutionary cause.
The Underground Railroad was a mass movement of civil disobedience, and it was the first mass movement in American history when huge numbers of American people made sacrifices for other people's human rights. That never happened before.
But what they're up against is an institution with more than 2 centuries of history in America. In the southern states, slavery grows deeper roots every year.
By 1860, the dollar value of America's slaves, there were about 4 million slaves by 1860, but the dollar value of those slaves were greater than the dollar value of all of America's banks, all of America's railroads, all of America's manufacturing combined. When you look at how the economics of slavery translated into the general economy of the nation, then you can see that slavery was not just some sideshow in American society. It was the main event in American history.
In the plantation economy of the South, where cotton is king, slave labor is the engine of growth. And to slave owners, a God-given right.
See, some people figure slavery would just run its course. I don't believe it would have run its course unless there was an economic reason for us no longer to be of value. But as long as people were allowed to enslave someone else and do whatever they wanted to, they were going to do it and fight to the death for the right to do it.
But the United States is a country divided. While slavery is deeply entrenched in the South, in the North, it had been gradually abolished with the coming of industry. The cities are full of cheap labor, and factories and machines do the work of slaves. The boundary separating free and slave states falls along the old Mason-Dixon line, extending west to the frontier. And that puts Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, on the front line of the great struggle over slavery.
Philadelphia was the first place in the United States to produce the human synergy that made the Underground Railroad and abolitionism work. That's to say, first, a large Quaker population, and the Quakers were the first organized group in the United States to collectively oppose slavery, and more than that, you had a large free black population. And those two groups are the two working together that make the Underground Railroad work so well.
A year after joining the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, William Still has learned how the railroad works, its methods, its escape routes, and its code of secrecy.
The slave and his particular friends could only meet in private to transact the business of the Underground Railroad. All others were outsiders. The right hand was not to know what the left hand was doing.
Legend has it, it was a slave catcher who gave the Underground Railroad its name, when the runaway he was chasing seemed to just disappear, as though the earth had swallowed him up. But the name stuck. And every year, hundreds of slaves ride that railroad. Most flee from the upper slave states, but the economic threat to the South is potentially crippling.
They see the Underground Railroad as a scourge of the nation. That in fact what they are doing is making their property unsecure because it is providing an outlet for those who want to run. It's encouraging those who may not think about running to think about running. And it also illustrates, in fact, that what they are saying to the rest of the nation, that enslaved people are content in their situation, is not true.
Slave owners are puzzled by the Exodus, and they regard the Underground Railroad as nothing more than organized theft.
There were some slaveholders who actually argued that they were holding these people in slavery as a way of protecting those people, as a way of providing security for people who could not provide security for themselves. That's the way that slaveholders reconciled that great contradiction. You know, the contradiction that said, I believe in freedom, but I have those people as my slaves.
Most runaways don't make it far. They're picked up by the marshals, run down by hunting dogs, or professional slave catchers. The newspapers are full of advertisements offering rewards for the recapture of fugitives. And William Still keeps records of them, like snapshots from the life of a slave.
Ran away. A Negro woman and 2 children. A few days before she went, I burnt her with a hot iron on the left side of her face. I tried to make the letter M. Ran away. A Negro man named Henry. his left eye out, some scars from a dirk on his left arm, and much scarred with a whip. $50 paid to whomever returns him. Matilda, a young mulatto, branded on the right breast with the letters NB, had with her a small child when she ran.
Of all the reasons to run, the beatings, the hard labor, the starvation diet, none compare to the breaking apart of family. Slave auctions are big business in the South. Some cities have permanent holding pens, and the auction houses advertise their wares on Main Street, next to the tack shops and hardware stores.
Now you can recover from the whippings, you'll have the scars, but when your children are taken from you, when your family is taken from you, that's a longing that can never be resolved. That's a longing that becomes embedded in who you are, part of your personality. So they feared that. That was the most powerless place to be, was on that auction block.
The horrors of the block was looked upon through the light of the daily heartbreaking separations it was causing to the oppressed. No pen could describe, or mind imagine. Hence, many of the passengers ascribed their first undying resolution to strike for freedom to the auction block, or to the fear of soon having to take their chances thereon.
They essentially had no choice. They could remain where they were and know what they would be facing until the day they dropped dead or were whipped to death or were sold further south only to have it happen then, or they could take that chance.
William Still's own mother took that chance. She'd escaped from a plantation in Maryland long before William was born. But she'd paid a terrible price.
Like millions of my race, my mother and father were born slaves, but were not contented to live and die so. My father purchased himself in early manhood by hard toil. Mother saw no way for herself and her children to escape the horrors of bondage but by flight.
The first time Sidney Still ran, she and her 4 children were recaptured and taken back to the plantation. But she was determined to try again. William remembers her telling him about a memory that had haunted her since childhood.
She had been witness to the fact that her own father's brains had been blown out by the discharge of a heavily loaded gun, deliberately aimed at his head by his drunken master. She needed only half a chance to make a bold strike for freedom.
The second time she ran, she knew she'd never make it with all 4 children. She must choose. The 2 boys, aged 6 and 8, had the best chance of survival on their own.
I shall never forget hearing my mother speak of the night when she fled. She went to the bed where her 2 boys were sleeping, kissed them, consigned them into the hands of God, and took her departure for the land of liberty.
Now think about what that means to a person. She's got to make a decision, which of her children is she going to leave in slavery in order for her to experience freedom and 2 of her children to experience freedom. I mean, that's a terrible choice to have to make. How do you make such a decision?
I mean, the slave master had his way with women. And so you take the girls. You figure that the boys would grow into strong men and can kind of defend themselves in some way, but the girls were just there for the taking, for the picking, for the liking, for the evening. So you grab the meekest and you run.
They traveled at night without map or compass. only the North Star to guide them. The days they spent hiding in swamps or caves, knowing that to be spotted was to be caught.
I have somewhere a piece that I've written thinking about her, and I can remember on the inside of me in the writing, the rhythm in my head was hiding by day, running by night, running, 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 praying. Oh, my goodness, can you imagine? But they did it. They did it.
It took them weeks to reach the Delaware River and cross into the free state of New Jersey. The Still family settled on a 40-acre homestead in a remote farming community. And it's here that William was born and raised, the last of 18 children.
My mother and father were again reunited in freedom, while 2 of the little boys were in slavery. What to do for them, other than weep and pray, were questions unanswerable. For over 40 years, the mother's heart never knew what it was to be free from anxiety about her lost boys.
Sydney changed her name to Charity and fabricated a story to throw the slave catchers off the scent. Only the Still family knows the truth about her past and those 2 little boys she'd left behind.
And William Still said that dark cloud with which he grew up shaped his character. It taught him compassion. It taught him to love freedom, to hate tyranny and slavery.
By the late 1840s, William Still has become the chief conductor on one of the busiest branches of the Underground Railroad. And his own house is a frequent stopover for runaways.
He was the secretary for the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. He was on the Vigilance Committee out of Philadelphia, and he had a system and a whole network of people that he was working with to create an opportunity for people to get away. It was almost like a way station or a halfway house on the way through.
I mean, you realize that for a period of time, he was helping something in the neighborhood of 60 slaves a month to escape, to go farther north, sometimes all the way to Canada, from their runaway point in the South.
The Underground Railroad has now laid tracks all over the country. It's grown into a complex network of safe houses and hiding places, stretching from the South to the free states north of the Mason-Dixon line. And any slave willing to chance it can rely on William Still to be waiting on the other side. In 1849, Still is in on the most famous escape in the history of the Underground Railroad. Henry Brown is a slave in Richmond, Virginia, who'd made friends with a local merchant. And together, they cook up a wild and risky plan. The crate is just big enough for Brown to huddle inside. The merchant, a man named Samuel Smith, writes the address of the anti-slavery office on the lid, bores a single small breathing hole in the side, and nails it shut for shipment. For the next 28 hours, Henry Brown suffers in silence, fighting for air, heaved from train to steamer to wagon. By the time he arrives at the anti-slavery office, William Still doubts he's still alive.